Hello, everyone. As the title says, this lesson is going to be on hormones involved in pregnancy. I'll also go back and review a little bit of what we talked about in a previous lesson, some of the extraembryonic structures like the umbilical cord, and I'll also talk about the birth process itself, or parturition, and lactation after the birth. I'll apologize in advance. This one is going to have a fair amount of text, more than I normally like to have on these lessons, but a few pictures in that I'll primarily kind of focus on anyway. So the first hormone that we haven't come across at all before, a human chorionic gonadotropin or gonadotropic hormone, or simply abbreviated as it shows here, HCG. So this is a hormone that is produced by cells at the outer border of the blastocyst. So this picture here, it's really kind of small, but that is the blastocyst. You probably can't make out the text. What it shows, this one here, this is the blastocele. That is the fluid on the inside of the blastocyst. This here says the inner cell mass right here. That is what eventually primarily gives rise to the embryo itself. And around the outside, this is the one that I'm going to focus on right now. This here does say the trophoblast. The trophoblast, these outer layer of cells that we do find around the outside of the blastocyst, that is what is producing this hormone, the human chorionic gonadotropin. So the production of this hormone is going to increase. It reaches a maximum. We'll take a look at a graph that shows this as well, somewhere around 7 to 10 weeks into the pregnancy. So what it actually does is kind of similar to the luteinizing hormone, and that is it maintains this structure right here within the ovaries, and that is the corpus luteum. So remember that prior to the formation of the corpus luteum, we have the follicular development. Eventually, we have ovulation as the egg is being released out of the ovary, and then after that, the remaining follicular cells still inside of the ovary, they're transformed into the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum, hopefully you recall, produces estrogen and progesterone. Prior to the release of the egg, it's only the estrogen that is produced by the follicular cells, but both estrogen and progesterone produced by the corpus luteum. So after fertilization does take place and implantation, the corpus luteum, it is going to increase in size due to stimulation from the luteinizing hormone. That's going to increase the production of both estrogen and progesterone. And of course, we talked about a number of the functions related to estrogen and progesterone. Many functions associated with estrogen increases when a female reaches puberty. That leads to the development of sexual sex or secondary sex characteristics. And also, of course, really, really important at the beginning of the menstrual cycle for increasing the thickness of the endometrial lining. And then later on, along with the progesterone, for maintaining the endometrial lining. So if for some reason the ovaries or the corpus luteum are removed prior to about the 11th week into the pregnancy, then there will not be enough of the estrogen and progesterone that is produced, not enough to maintain the endometrial lining, and the endometrial lining will be shed off along with the implanted embryo, and that will lead to, as I have here, a spontaneous abortion. So I thought I'd stick this one in here as well about pregnancy tests, because this really does have to do with that human chorionic gonadotropin hormone. This is what is being tested for at sort of the common pregnancy test. So this here, it's not that clear on the picture, but this is showing a picture of one of these devices for doing a home pregnancy test. If we take a look at the graph, it's showing within the pregnancy, the weeks within the pregnancy, and it's showing the concentration of the human chorionic gonadotropin. So yeah, we can see here it reaches a peak somewhere, in this case, it shows it at about week 12 where it reaches its peak. It does start to increase fairly quickly, and because it increases fairly quickly when implantation does take place, that is why it is the pregnancy test hormone. So I did mention after implantation. So down here, again, difficult to kind of read this, but it can detect in the urine. So it is the female's urine where this hormone is going to enter into. So it's going to go from the blastocyst into the mother's circulation. It's going to end up passing through Bowman's capsule, ending up in the urine, and then it's going to be detectable using the home pregnancy test. What it does show in this picture as well is there are antibodies in this home testing device, and these antibodies are going to attach to the hormone, the human chorionic gonadotropin hormone that we find in the urine sample. So if that hormone is present, it attaches to the antibodies, and what we see in terms of the home pregnancy test is two of these little bars instead of just a single bar, and that would indicate that the female is pregnant. So if the female were to use this prior to implantation, then she would not get a positive result, even though the human chorionic gonadotropin might be produced by the blastocyst. Until implantation occurs, there is no way for that hormone to enter into the mother's circulation. So back to the estrogen, we saw that it is produced by the corpus luteum. After the first trimester, the placenta, so one of those extra embryonic structures, is going to be pumping out huge amounts of estrogen. So just like with the corpus luteum, as it got bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more estrogen is produced. As the placenta becomes more and more developed, then there's going to be much, much more estrogen that's going to be produced. I'm not going to read through all of these points here with the functions of estrogen, but it is specifically with these points here during the pregnancy. There's just one that I do want to point out, and that's this one. So estrogen is going to cause uterine contractions when it's at high concentrations. And this is going to be kind of important when it comes around to the female actually giving birth. When we talk about contractions, the uterus, it is a muscle and it does contract, and that's what's going to expel the fetus out of the uterus and out of the vagina through the birth canal. Progesterone, similarly, it's produced initially by the corpus luteum. Just like with the estrogen, it's later then produced in larger amounts by the placenta. So that also means that after there's sufficient amount that's produced by the placenta, there's really no longer need for the corpus luteum to producing either the estrogen or the progesterone. Again, a whole bunch of functions of the progesterone during the pregnancy. Remember some of these fine distinctions between the estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen increases the thickness of the endometrial lining. We talk more about progesterone maintaining the endometrial lining and increasing the vascularization, which means more blood vessels inside of the uterus. And that, of course, is where all the exchange is going to take place within the uterus between the mother and the developing embryo and eventually the fetus. The one key thing that I'll point out here that whereas estrogen causes uterine contractions, progesterone is going to prevent uterine contractions. So we'll come back and we'll take another look at that as well in the form of a graph. So this shows three different hormones, the three that I've just mentioned. So the first one here, the HCG. This one, a huge increase very, very early on. And again, if we take a look at this peak here, yeah, somewhere around the 8th or 9th week. So this is kind of misleading, this picture here as well. Everything that we've been talking about so far, time zero is the point of fertilization. That is not the point on this graph. And we can tell that that is not point zero or time zero on this graph because it has ovulation taking place right here, which is about 2 weeks. So in this particular graph, time zero, this is the beginning of the female's menstrual cycle. So this would be the start of the flow phase. And of course, we know that it's about halfway through the female's reproductive cycle that we have ovulation that's taking place. Shortly after that, fertilization would take place, and about a week after that, implantation would occur. So where we see this increase, even though according to this, it's somewhere around week 4, that would not be week 4 after fertilization. That would be about week 4 after beginning of the female's menstrual cycle. At any rate, what we see is a very, very huge increase compared to progesterone and estrogen, and that's why this one here is the one that's used for a home pregnancy test. The only time that this should really be produced is when a female is pregnant, because it is only produced by the trophoblastic cells that we find on the outside of the blastocyst. If we take a look at the other two hormones here, notice that both the progesterone and the estrogen is going to be increasing. And as we saw, after about this point here, it's going to be the placenta that's going to take over the role of producing both of these female sex hormones, and a minor amount would then be produced by the corpus luteum. So as the placenta gets larger and larger, huge amounts of these are produced. Now let's go back to that point that I mentioned, that progesterone inhibits uterine contractions, estrogen causes uterine contractions. So early on in the pregnancy, you do not want uterine contractions. So that's why we have, and it's really the ratio that we're talking about here, the proportion of estrogen and the progesterone. And what we see is that through, well, 2/3 of the pregnancy, there is more progesterone relative to the estrogen. So this is then going to prevent the uterine contractions, which again, you don't want early in the pregnancy, otherwise it would expel the fetus. Then we have this little bit of a change here. So at about 2/3 of the way through, slowly it starts to kind of switch over, and there's an increase in the amount of estrogen. The greater that difference between the estrogen and the progesterone, the more contractions we're going to see. So we talk about the timing between the contractions in the female's uterus. And as these contractions come really close together, that means that there's going to be, well, a big difference, a large difference between the amount of estrogen, which is causing the contractions, and progesterone, which is preventing the contractions. Right at the very end here, where we see this huge difference, that is when we're going to have the contractions, and that is when birth is going to take place. So I'm going to go back and just review a little bit about a couple of the extra embryonic structures, the placenta and the umbilical cord. So a little bit of a reminder, this is our blastocyst that we're taking a look at here. Inner cell mass, again, this is really what is forming the embryo for the most part. And the trophoblast is producing the extra embryonic structures for the most part. So a couple of those extra embryonic structures, they are the placenta and the umbilical cord. So when we do have the initial implantation of the blastocyst attaching to, making contact with, eventually embedding itself into the endometrial lining of the uterus, we have this initial growth of the trophoblastic cells, and it forms these finger-like projections, which are called the chorionic villi. And if you think back to the digestive system, there were villi and microvilli in the digestive system as well. And the function of those were to greatly increase the surface area to maximize the absorption of nutrients from the gut across the lining of the small intestine and eventually into the circulation. Kind of a similar role with the chorionic villi. They once again greatly increase surface area, and in this case, it's to maximize the exchange of nutrients and wastes between the mother and between the embryo and eventually the fetus as well. So chorionic villi, kind of important structures. These will continue to develop throughout the pregnancy. They are found inside of the placenta. Picture on the left-hand side here, really important that you're able to identify the extra embryonic structures and that you know the function of these extra embryonic structures. So if we start with some of the simple ones here, we can tell that the baby is fairly well developed. So sort of the transition point between when we call it an embryo and when we call it a fetus is 8 weeks after fertilization. So up until 8 weeks, it is an embryo. After 8 weeks, it is a fetus. So taking a look at the size of this and the developmental stages that we see, this will be the fetal stage or the fetus that we see at this point. It has here identified the umbilical cord, varies considerably in its length from a few centimeters to possibly 30 or 40 centimeters in length. So this is the connecting tube, which contains blood vessels going back and forth between the placenta and the fetus, the belly button fetus. So it is really just a transport tube, and it arises from a previous structure, which is called the elencoas. A couple of other things that aren't identified on here, but they do show them right here in yellow. That is the yolk sac. So in terms of other animals besides placental animals, it does have a role in terms of providing nutrients. In the case of mammals, the nutrients are coming from the placenta, from the mother. So the yolk sac considerably smaller in mammals compared to something like an amphibian or a reptile or a bird. And what we say is that for mammals, one of the functions is the early development of the red blood cells. So that is the yolk sac, fairly small, that we see here. In blue, this would be the amniotic fluid. All of this in blue that the fetus is splashing around in, the amniotic fluid. It provides a comfortable, stable environment, controls the temperature, and also provides some cushioning for the embryo and for the fetus. So to use kind of an analogy, we have previously learned about the nervous system, the brain, and cerebral spinal fluid that cushions the brain within the skull, and the amniotic fluid kind of cushions the fetus, the embryo, and the fetus within the uterus. Around the outside would be a thin membrane, which is called amnion. So amniotic fluid and the fetus and the umbilical cord would all be contained within the amnion. The most important, I guess, of these structures is the placenta. So the placenta, again, is where all of the exchange is taking place. So if we take a look at the right-hand picture now, kind of zooming in on what we see in this box here, the placenta is made up of the mother's portion, the maternal portion, and the fetal portion, which again is going to be coming from those trophoblastic cells. So in the case of the female's portion, very, very vascular endometrial lining, which is giving rise to the mother's portion of the placenta. Remember that progesterone is going to be maintaining the endometrial lining and also increasing, well, the vascularization, the blood vessels. So this is what really the embryo and the fetus is dependent upon for all of its oxygen, its nutrients, amino acids, fatty acids, glucose, vitamins, minerals, and also getting rid of all the wastes that it is producing as well. Important to realize that there's no actual mixing of the blood. So mom's blood does come in, which is rich in, well, those things that I mentioned, the oxygen and the glucose and the amino acids, and it now needs to pass into the baby's circulation, or at least the circulation in the baby's portion of the placenta. So it's showing here again, very kind of elaborate network of capillaries. Inside of these would be the chorionic villi. So again, huge surface area with these capillaries. So now we can have the process of diffusion. We do need to have the nutrients and oxygen that goes out of the mother circulation and into the fetal circulation without any actual mixing of the blood. And for the most part, it's just passing down its concentration gradient. More oxygen in the mother circulation than in the fetal circulation. So it will be moving down the concentration gradient into the fetal circulation. So from these chorionic villi, from the fetal portion of the placenta, now those things can pass out through the umbilical cord, the transport tube, and eventually reach the fetus. I'm not going to read through all of these points here. I pretty much summarized most of this, but the picture at the bottom as well shows a whole bunch of things that are going from the mother and to the fetus. So oxygen, water, electrolyte salts like sodium, calcium, potassium, carbohydrates, the glucose, lipids, fatty acids, polypeptides, the amino acids, vitamins, minerals, hormones as well, and some other things. Not everything is necessarily good. So drugs, whether it's legal or illegal drugs, they will pass from the mother circulation into the fetus circulation as well. Some viruses will pass through, pathogens will pass through. So some things that can certainly be harmful to the baby. And along with drugs, that also includes some fairly common drugs like nicotine that you would find in cigarette smoke, caffeine that you would find in coffee, tea, chocolate, other caffeinated beverages. They are going to be passing through. Those are also drugs. And alcohol. Alcohol also passes through. I just want to touch on this very last point that I have here. You do need to know about what are called teratogens. So I have here, besides nutrients and waste passing through the placenta, other chemicals. So drugs and yes, alcohol, nicotine, they pass through and have quite often devastating effects on the development of embryo in particular. Here I have the fetus, but most definitely the embryo even more so than the fetus. So these have what we call teratogenic effects, and these are referred to as teratogens. teratogen, something that would pass through the placenta from the mother to the embryo and the fetus, that can have detrimental effects on the eventual development. And you might be familiar with the effect associated with alcohol consumption by the mother, and this is referred to as fetal alcohol syndrome, or I believe now it's fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. So we're almost there. Now it's time for the baby to come out, and that is simply the process that is referred to as parturition. And lactation is the production of milk. So a couple of final hormones to chat a little bit about here, in addition to the ones we've already talked about, but I will go back to, and also we'll have to talk a little bit more about the estrogen and the progesterone. So at the end of the pregnancy, yes, the uterus, which is a muscle, it begins to contract, it becomes more excitable, and finally we end up with these strong rhythmic contractions that are going to result in the baby being delivered out of the birth canal. So reasons for this, and they're kind of tied together as well to some extent. So changes in hormones and also mechanical or physical changes to the uterine muscle itself. So hormonal factors, this is the one I already talked a little bit about, which is the ratio of the estrogen to progesterone. So again, as the pregnancy goes on, you're going to have more and more of the estrogen relative to the progesterone, and it's the estrogen that's going to be causing uterine contractions. This is a big one here, oxytocin. Oxytocin, just briefly mentioned it in the past. It is produced by the hypothalamus. It does involve the posterior pituitary, but it's released by. It's not produced by the posterior pituitary. It is produced in the hypothalamus, stored and eventually released from the posterior pituitary. So increased production increases, it causes uterine contractions. Uterine contractions, along with the abdominal muscles, are what are going to deliver the baby. And this is the hormone. If someone is being induced, this is the hormone that they are given. It is going to cause the uterine contraction. So if a female is reaching her due date, if she's not experiencing contractions, if the baby should be coming out, it's full term, it's big enough, but it's not, then this is what the female will be given, is oxytocin. So kind of a nice picture here that summarizes that. So it does show us that the pituitary is going to be releasing the oxytocin. We know that the placenta, this here is just estrogen, and this is our progesterone. So those are kind of our three big hormones that we've talked about so far. So I think probably where it has inhibits here, I'm not sure what that is. If that's early in the pregnancy, it's not really an inhibitory effect, so I'm not sure about those two ones. But what we do know is that at least later in the pregnancy, the estrogen is going to trigger the release of oxytocin, and it's the oxytocin that's going to increase the uterine contractions. Again, we do know that our progesterone, it does inhibit the uterine contractions. So once again, as the pregnancy goes on, we're going to have an increase in the estrogen relative to the amount of progesterone. That's going to trigger an increased release of oxytocin, and that's going to lead to uterine contractions. One more bio 31 is this one here, prostoglandins, and it does appear on the diploma exam. So prostaglandins are also going to be produced, in this case by the fetus, produced by the fetus, but the target is the female. It is the uterus, and it's going to cause contractions as well. So kind of keep in mind these four different hormones. So estrogen, leading to the production of oxytocin, causing uterine contractions, less progesterone relative to the estrogen to prevent the uterine contractions, and finally the prostaglandins also enhancing the uterine contractions. This is kind of a minor one. It's kind of a small area within the pelvis of a female that allows for the baby to pass through, and part of this does have to do with our upright stature. If you take a look at most other mammals that run around on four legs, it's much easier to deliver the baby because there's much more space going through the pelvic bones. That's not the case due to the upright nature and the anatomy of humans. And that makes it much more challenging for humans to deliver babies. So this one here, relaxin, it just kind of eases up the ligaments that we do have within the pelvis and makes it a little bit easier to have the baby delivered. And again, the prostaglandins that I previously mentioned, which are going to help with the uterine contractions. I mentioned that the hormonal and the mechanical factors, they're kind of connected together. So the uterus is a muscle, and when you do stretch a muscle, then the response is for that muscle to contract. So as the baby gets bigger and bigger and bigger, as we see in this picture here, so as we go across from left to right, the fetus is getting bigger. And what this is going to do is it's going to push out and it's going to stretch the muscle, the uterus itself. So when the stretching does take place, it's going to cause the excitation and that's going to cause contraction. So the simple stretching out will also lead to contraction, and that's more of the mechanical factor. Again, there is a connection because it is the stretching that actually ends up also stimulating the hypothalamus to produce and the posterior pituitary to release the oxytocin. Finally, the last of the hormone is for the production of milk. So lactation is necessary for mammals because once that baby does come out, it needs nutrients, and it needs nutrients and rich nutrients and concentrated nutrients fairly quickly, and that is what is provided in the breast milk. So this hormone here, prolactin, it is for the production of milk. So where does prolactin come from? Well, it is produced by the anterior pituitary. So most of the time there is a releasing hormone, an inhibiting hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormone. If a female is not pregnant, if she has not given birth, then it is the inhibiting hormone that is produced by the hypothalamus, and it in turn prevents the production of prolactin. But when the female has delivered, it's now no longer the inhibiting hormone. It is the releasing hormone by the hypothalamus that tells the anterior pituitary to now produce the prolactin. Prolactin circulates around. It targets the glandular tissue within the breasts, and it is for, yes, the production of the milk. So now we have milk that's being produced, but we still need that milk to be released out of the mammary glands. And now we go back to the oxytocin. So just like oxytocin is going to cause contraction of the uterus, it's also going to cause contraction of the glandular tissue within the mammary glands, within the breast, for the release of the milk. So prolactin for the production of milk, oxytocin is for the release of that milk. So eventually it can make its way to the baby. And that's the last picture that I have here. So it shows us on the right-hand side what we did already talk about in terms of delivering the baby, the role of oxytocin in causing the uterine contractions that we see over here. But in addition, on the left-hand side, it has milk expression. So that, I guess, would involve the prolactin as well, the production, suckling action of the baby, the feeding of the baby. This is our second positive feedback mechanism that we have. So as we have the baby that's feeding, that's going to lead to even more of the oxytocin being produced, even more of the prolactin being produced, and more milk being produced and released as well. And just one final note, even after the baby is delivered, that oxytocin is going to continue to lead to uterine contractions, and that is going to serve a couple of functions as I have here, reducing any bleeding or hemorrhaging, and eventually over time, returning the uterus back to the original shape, the original size.